Let me tell you something that's been bothering me for months. Something hardly anyone in the crypto world is paying attention to, yet it has the power to change the entire future of XRP. I'm talking about a possible XRP supply crisis. Yeah, you heard that right. And before you roll your eyes and call it another conspiracy theory, I want you to sit with me for a few minutes. Listen carefully, because once you understand what's happening behind the scenes, you might never look at XRP the same way again. It all started for me on a random night, around 2 a.m., when I was scrolling through charts, on-chain data, whale movements, all the usual stuff. XRP was doing what it always does, moving sideways, refusing to pump, making everyone impatient. But something unusual caught my eye. Something about the escrow data. You know how Ripple locks up the majority of XRP supply in escrow every month, right? Well, I noticed that the pattern of releases and returns was starting to shift. Not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly, almost silently. And when things move silently in crypto, that's when you should pay the most attention. At first, I ignored it. Thought it was just temporary, some technical update, whatever. But a few days later, I saw something even more interesting. XRP that was being returned to escrow was slightly less than before. The circulating supply wasn't exploding, but it wasn't staying as stagnant as people assumed either. So naturally, I dug deeper. And that's where the rabbit hole started. I began cross-checking data from CMC, Masari, Ripple's own monthly reports, and even tracking whale wallets. What I found shocked me. XRP liquidity, actual real liquidity, not theoretical supply, was shrinking. Not the total supply, not the escrow amount, but the effective, active trading supply. The liquid XRP that is actually available on exchanges, market makers, and ODL corridors was thinning out. At first glance, this doesn't look like a big deal. Most people think XRP has too much supply anyway. Bro, it's 100 billion tokens. How can it ever face a supply crisis? That's what everyone says, and that's why nobody's talking about this, because they're looking at supply the way it existed in 2017, not the way it looks today. Let me explain. Out of the full 100 billion XRP, a huge portion is locked in escrow. Another massive amount is in dead wallets. Some portion is stuck in exchange reserves that never move. Millions belong to long-term holders who simply don't sell. Institutions using ODL need stable liquidity, not tradable liquidity. And a chunk is lost forever. Yes, lost, not coming back. And what's left? The part that actually circulates. The part you and I trade. The part that moves the price. That's the portion that's shrinking. Imagine a supermarket with 1,000 bags of rice. The store owner keeps 900 bags stored in a warehouse far away, locked up. 50 bags were lost. Another 40 are held by customers who refuse to sell. Now the entire city is fighting over the remaining 10 bags. What happens? Price goes up. Not because rice suddenly became special, but because supply became tight. Now think of XRP in the same way. The world sees 100 billion tokens. But the real world might only have a fraction of that in active circulation. This is where things get even more interesting. I started mapping exchange wallets. Binance, Coinbase, Kraken, Bitstamp, and several smaller Asian exchanges. Do you know what I discovered? Many major exchanges are holding less XRP than they were holding 2 years ago. Not because XRP is being dumped. No, it's the opposite. Whales are withdrawing and storing them offline. Cold wallets are growing. Exchange liquidity pools are shrinking. And every time a crypto loses liquidity on exchanges, you know what happens? The token becomes extremely sensitive to demand spikes. When you combine low exchange liquidity with institutional demand through ODL, it creates the perfect recipe for pricing pressure. Think about it. Banks and financial institutions using ODL don't invest in XRP. They use it. They need fast-moving liquidity, tokens that travel between corridors, not tokens locked in someone's cold wallet for 5 years. So when available supply starts shrinking, institutions feel it first. And after them, the retail market feels it. And when retail feels it, Prices don't rise slowly, they explode. Now let me be honest here. I'm not predicting XRP will hit some unrealistic number overnight. I'm not one of those $589 tomorrow people. But when you look at how markets behave, you'll see that supply shortages create exponential price movements. It's the same with Bitcoin halving. The supply shock pushes price upward, not because demand suddenly increases, but because available supply suddenly decreases. And XRP might be heading toward its own version of a supply shock. Let me give you another angle. Do you remember how Ripple has been expanding ODL corridors across the world? Mexico, Philippines, Brazil, Europe, Singapore. Every new corridor increases liquidity demand. And here's the fun part. ODL requires holding XRP temporarily to process transactions. Not for trading, but for actual usage. And every time more institutions join, more XRP gets tied up in ODL cycles. Now combine that with shrinking exchange supply, increasing whale accumulation, and the fact that XRP's total supply isn't as massive as people think. Suddenly, the picture begins to make sense. But here's the kicker, and nobody talks about this. Ripple itself, despite having billions in escrow, is using XRP more efficiently. They release 1 billion per month, return around 800 to 900 million, and use the rest for liquidity programs or institutional partners. But even Ripple is heading toward a point where their free-to-use XRP supply gets thinner each year. Escrow unlocks do not increase circulating supply at the rate people think, because most of it goes right back. And whatever stays unlocked goes into predictable, controlled channels, not into dumping. So now we have shrinking exchange supply, growing institutional demand, locked escrow supply, dead lost XRP, increasing accumulation, ODL using XRP as working capital retail holding tightly. This, my friend, is the foundation of a supply crisis. But the reason nobody talks about it is that people assume XRP supply will always be abundant. They see big numbers and think it means infinite availability. But markets don't care about numbers. They care about liquidity. A token with 1 trillion supply can face a liquidity crisis. A token with 1 million supply can have abundance. It's not about how much exists. It's about how much is accessible. And when you track indicators of accessibility, XRP is tightening. I'll give you an example. One exchange, won't name it, but one of the top 10, had over 1.2 billion XRP in 2021. Today, less than 250 million. That's nearly an 80% drop. And it's not because users sold. The tokens moved off exchange into private wallets. When whales stop selling, supply thins. When supply thins, price sensitivity skyrockets. When institutional usage grows at the same time, liquidity becomes precious. And that's what I fear. Or maybe fear isn't the right word. Maybe anticipate is better. Because if you understand how supply shocks work, you know what comes next. You know what I find ironic? People complain that XRP price doesn't move. They call it a stable coin. They call it boring. But do you know what happens right before a supply crisis hits? Price stagnates. Quiet accumulation. Boring sideways action. This is the calm before the storm phase. Markets accumulate in silence. They explode loudly. I see people making jokes. Bro, XRP never moves. Bro, wake me up when XRP does something. Bro, XRP is dead. And I just sit there thinking, if only you knew what's happening beneath the surface. It's like an iceberg. Everyone sees the top. Nobody sees the massive structure hidden underwater. Let me tell you something else most people don't realize. When liquidity becomes scarce, it doesn't just pump price. It triggers liquidity hunts. Exchanges start adjusting spreads. Market makers widen their pricing. Whales strategically become the new liquidity providers. And when whales become the liquidity providers, they decide the price, not retail. A future where XRP becomes expensive, really expensive, is not impossible. Not because of hype, not because of news, but because available supply becomes rare. Look at gold, look at oil, look at Bitcoin. Every major asset that ever experienced a supply squeeze went on massive bull runs. Not because they suddenly became useful, but because supply became limited while demand stayed intact. Now imagine XRP, a token explicitly designed for global liquidity and cross-border settlement, entering a phase where its liquidity supply becomes constrained. That's not just a pump. That's an economic event. You know what else gives me goosebumps? The timeline. Ripple's legal battles are clearing, regulations are forming, more countries are integrating blockchain rails, CBDCs are expanding, banks looking for faster settlement rails are increasing, and all this is happening at the same time XRP's liquid supply might be declining. It's like the perfect setup. A globally scalable payment asset meets global demand at the exact moment circulating supply starts tightening. I'm not saying this guarantees XRP will moon tomorrow. I'm not saying you should buy XRP. I'm not saying price predictions like $100 soon are real. I don't believe in fantasies. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing, what the data is whispering. Patterns repeat themselves. History echoes. And the signs are there, clear as day if you have the courage to look.